Esther 1. And it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, that Ahasuerus reigned from India to Ethiopia, over 127 provinces. That in those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in the fortress of Susa, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a banquet for all his princes and his servants, so that the power of Persia and Media and the nobles and princes of the provinces were before him, to show the riches of the glory of his kingdom, and the splendor of his excellent greatness, for many days, even 180 days. And when those days were over, the king made a banquet for all the people who were in the fortress of Susa, from the greatest to the least, for 7 days, in the courtyard of the garden of the royal palace. The tapestries were of white, green, and sky-blue cloth, hung with cords of fine linen and purple, and rings of silver, and pillars of marble, the beds of gold and silver, on a pavement of red, and blue, and white, and black marble. And people drank from golden cups, and the cups were different from one another, and there was much royal wine, according to the king's generosity. And drinking was by law, without constraint, because the king had expressly commanded all the officials of his house to do according to the will of each one. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet to the women in the royal house of King Ahasuerus. And on the 7th day, when the king's heart was glad of wine, she sent to Momin, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar and Carcass, the 7 chamberlains who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus. Let them introduce Queen Vashti into the presence of the king, with the royal crown, to show the people and princes her beauty, because she was beautiful to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come according to the king's word, through the chamberlains, so the king was very angry, and his wrath was kindled in him. Then she asked the king of the wise men who understood the times, because this is how the king's affairs were handled in the presence of all who knew the law and right. And those closest to him were Carsenna, Shethar, Admata, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of the Persians and the Medes, who saw the face of the king, and sat as rulers in the kingdom. What, according to the law, should be done to Queen Vashti, for not having obeyed the order of King Ahasuerus, through the chamberlains? Then Memucan said in the presence of the king and the princes, not only against the king has Queen Vashti sinned, but also against all the princes, and against all the people that are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the news of what the queen has done will reach all the women, so that in their eyes they will despise their husbands when they hear it said, King Ahasuerus ordered Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she did not come. And on this very day the ladies of Persia and Media, hearing what the queen did, will say the same to all the king's princes, and so there will be much contempt and indignation. If it seems good to the king, let a royal edict come out from him, and write it in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, and not revoke it, namely, that Vashti no longer enters the presence of King Ahasuerus, and the king gives her kingdom to another who is better than her. And when the commandment is heard, which the king will decree throughout his kingdom, for it is great, all women will give honor to their husbands, from the greatest to the youngest. And these words seemed good in the eyes of the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. Then he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to every province according to their script, and to every people according to their language, that every man should be master in his own house, and that he should speak according to the language of his people. Esther 2. When these things were over, and the wrath of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti, and what he had done, and what had been decreed concerning him. Then the king's servants who ministered to him said, Let virgin and beautiful girls be sought for the king. And the king shall place officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, and they shall gather all the virgin and beautiful maidens into the fortress of Susa, into the women's house, under the care of Haggai, the king's chamberlain, guardian of the women, and give them their ornaments. And the girl who looks good in the king's eyes, reign in Vashti's place. And this seemed good in the king's eyes, and he did so. Then there was a Jewish man in the fortress of Susa, whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who was transported from Jerusalem, with the captives who were carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, who had transported Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. He had created Hadassah, which is Esther, his uncle's daughter, because he had neither father nor mother, and she was a young woman, beautiful in presence and beautiful, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her for his daughter. It happened that, when the king's command and his law were published, and many young women gathered in the fortress of Susa, in the care of Haggai, they also took Esther to the king's house, under the custody of Haggai, guardian of the women. And the girl appeared beautiful in his eyes, and found favor with him, therefore she hastened to give him her ornaments, and her portions, as well as to give him 7 respectable girls from the king's house, and he made her pass with her girls to the best place in the women's house. Esther, however, did not declare her people and her relatives, because Mordecai had ordered her not to declare them. And Mordecai walked every day in front of the court of the women's house, to find out how Esther was doing, and what would happen to her. And when the turn came for each girl to come to King Ahasuerus, after it had been done to her according to the law of women, for 12 months, for in this way the days of her purifications were fulfilled, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with spices, and with things for the purification of women. In this way, then, the girl came to the king, she was given everything she wanted, to take with her from the women's house to the king's house. In the afternoon she entered, and in the morning she returned to the women's second house, under the care of Xerxes, the king's chamberlain, guardian of the concubines. She no longer returned to the king, unless the king desired her, and she was called by her name. Now when the turn of Esther, daughter of Abihail, uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, came to go to the king, she asked for nothing, except what Haggai, the king's chamberlain, guardian of the women, said. And Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus, to his royal house, in the 10th month, which is the month of Taves, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than all women, and obtained grace and favor before him more than all virgins, and he put the royal crown on her head, and made her queen in Vashti's place. Then the king gave a great feast to all his princes and his servants. It was Esther's banquet, and he gave relief to the provinces, and made gifts according to the king's generosity. And when the virgins came together the second time, Mordecai sat at the king's gate. Esther, however, did not declare her relatives and her people, as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther fulfilled Mordecai's command, as when he created her. In those days, as Mordecai sat at the king's gate, 2 of the king's chamberlains, from the guards of the gate, Bigtan and Teresh, were greatly indignant, and sought to attack King Ahasuerus. And this came to Mordecai's knowledge, and he told Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. And the matter was inquired into, and it was discovered, and they were both hanged on a gallows, and it was written in the chronicles before the king. Esther 3. After these things King Ahasuerus magnified Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and exalted him, and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. And all the king's servants, who were at the king's gate, bowed themselves and prostrated themselves before Haman, for thus had the king commanded concerning him, but Mordecai did not bow down or prostrate himself. Then the king's servants, who were at the king's gate, said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's commandment?" So it came to pass, when they told him this day after day, and he did not listen to them, that they told Haman, to see whether the words of Mordecai would stand, because he had declared to them that he was a Jew. Now when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or prostrate himself before him, Haman was filled with wrath. However, he had little reason, in his purposes, to lay his hands only on Mordecai, because they had declared to him what people Mordecai was from. Haman therefore sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the kingdom of Ahasuerus. In the 1st month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, that is, the lot, was cast before Haman, for every day, and for every month, until the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. And Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a people scattered and divided among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom, whose laws are different from the laws of all the people, and who do not keep the king's laws. That's why it doesn't suit the king to let him stay. If it seems good to the king, decree that they be killed, and I will put into the hands of those who do the work 10,000 talents of silver, that they may enter into the king's treasuries." Then the king took the ring from his hand, and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, an Agagite, enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "This silver is given to you as well as to the people, to do with them whatever seems good in your eyes." Then they called the king's clerks in the 1st month, on the 13th day of the same, and, according to all that Haman commanded, they wrote to the king's princes, and to the governors who were over every province, and to the leaders of every people, to every province according to its writing, and to every people according to their language. In the name of King Ahasuerus it was written, and with the king's ring it was sealed. And the letters were sent by post to all the king's provinces, so that they would destroy, kill and destroy all the Jews, from young to old, children and women, on the same day, on the 13th day of the month, 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the order that determined the dissemination of the law in each province was sent to all people, so that they would be prepared for that day. The couriers therefore, impelled by the word of the king, went out, and the law was proclaimed in the fortress of Susa. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was in confusion. Esther 4. When Mordecai heard all that had happened, he tore his clothes, and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, and cried out with a great and bitter cry. And he came to the king's gate, for no one clothed in sackcloth could enter the king's gate. And in all the provinces where the word of the king and his law reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, and weeping, and lamentation, and many were lying in sackcloth and in ashes. Then Esther's maids and her chamberlains came and told her, whereupon the queen was greatly grieved, and she sent clothes to clothe Mordecai, and to take off his sackcloth, but he did not accept them. Then Esther called Hadda, one of the king's chamberlains, whom he had appointed to serve her, and gave him orders to go to Mordecai, to find out what this was and why. And when Hadda went out to Mordecai, into the city square, which was before the king's gate, Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, as also the exact sum of the money, which Haman said he would give to the king's treasuries, for the Jews, to destroy them. He also gave him the copy of the written law, which was published in Susa, to destroy them, so that he could show it to Esther and let her know, and to order him to go to the king, and ask and plead with him in his presence for his people. So Hadda came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Then Esther spoke to Hadda, telling him to say to Mordecai, all the king's servants, and the people of the king's provinces, know well that every man or woman who comes to the king in the inner court, without being called, there is but one sentence, that of death, unless the king extends it to he is the golden scepter, that he may live, and in these 30 days I have not been called to go to the king. And they told Mordecai the words of Esther. Then Mordecai commanded them to answer Esther, do not imagine in your heart that, because you are in the king's house, you alone will escape among all the Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, help and deliverance will come to the Jews from another side, but you and your father's house will perish, and who knows whether for such a time as this thou hast arrived in this kingdom? Then Esther told them to say again to Mordecai, go, gather together all the Jews who are found in Susa, and fast for me, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, neither day nor night, and I and my maidservants will also fast in this way. And so I will go to the king, even if it is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went, and did according to all that Esther commanded him. Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and leave a comment. Esther 5. So it came to pass on the 3rd day that Esther dressed herself in royal apparel, and stood in the inner court of the king's house, opposite the king's chamber, and the king sat upon his royal throne, in the royal house, opposite the door of the chamber. And it came to pass, when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, that she found favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter, which she had in her hand, and Esther came and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king said to her, what do you want, Queen Esther, or what is your request? Up to half of the kingdom will be given to you. And Esther said, if it seems good to the king, come today with Haman to the banquet that I have prepared for him. Then the king said, make Haman hasten, so that Esther's desire may be granted. So when the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared, the king said to Esther at the banquet of wine, what is your request? And it will be granted to you, and what is your desire? And it will be done, even up to half of the kingdom. Then Esther answered and said, my request and desire is, if I have found favor in the king's eyes, and if it seems good to the king to grant me my request, and fulfill my desire, let the king come with Haman to the banquet that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do according to the king's word. So Haman went out that day happy and in good spirits, But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate, and that he did not stand up nor move before him, Haman was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Haman, however, refrained and went to his house, and he sent for his friends, and Xerxes' wife. And Haman told them the glory of his riches, and the multitude of his sons, and all that the king had exalted him in, and how he had exalted him above the king's princes and servants. And Haman said, Queen Esther did not make anyone come with the king to the banquet which he had prepared, except me, and also for tomorrow I am invited by her together with the king. But all this does not satisfy me as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then Xerxes' wife and all his friends said to him, Let a gallows be made 50 cubits high, and tomorrow tell the king that Mordecai be hanged on it, and then enters joyfully with the king to the banquet. And this advice seemed good to Haman, who ordered the gallows to be made. Esther 6. That same night the king's sleep fled. Then he ordered to bring the book of records of the Chronicles, which were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had denounced Bigtan and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains, who guarded the gate, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Then said the king, What honor and distinction hath this done to Mordecai? And the king's servants, who ministered with him, said, Nothing was done to him. Then said the king, Who is in the court? And Haman had gone into the outer court of the king's house, to tell the king that Mordecai should be hanged on the gallows which he had prepared for him. And the king's servants said unto him, Behold, Haman is in the court. And the king told him to come in. And when Haman came in, the king said to him, What will be done to the man whose honor the king delights in? Then Haman said in his heart, Whom would the king delight in to do him more honor than me? Thus said Haman to the king, To the man in whose honor the king delights, Bring the royal robe that the king usually wears, as well as the horse that the king usually rides, and put the royal crown on his head. And let the garment and the horse be given into the hand of one of the king's noblest princes, and put them on that man whom the king desires to honor, and take him on horseback through the streets of the city, and proclaim before him, Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king desires to honor. Then the king said to Haman, Make haste, take the garment and the horse, as you have said, and do this to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate, and omit nothing from everything you said. And Haman took the garment and the horse, and clothed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the streets of the city, and proclaimed before him, Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king desires to honor. After this Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman ran away to his house, sad, and with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and Zeresh's wife said to him, If Mordecai, before whom you have already begun to fall, is of the seed of the Jews, you will not prevail against him, but you will certainly fall before him. And while they were still talking with him, the king's chamberlains arrived and hurried to take Haman to the banquet that Esther had prepared. Esther 7. So when the king came with Haman to drink with Queen Esther, the king said to Esther again, on the second day, at the wine banquet, What is your request, Queen Esther? And it will be given to you. And what is your wish? Up to half of the kingdom will be given to you. Then Queen Esther answered and said, If, O king, I have found grace in thy sight, and if it please the king, let my life be given to me as my petition, and my people as my desire. Because we were sold, I and my people, to destroy, kill, and annihilate us once and for all, if they still sold us for male and female servants, I would remain silent, yet the oppressor could not have compensated for the king's loss. Then spake King Ahasuerus, and said unto Queen Esther, Who is this, and where is this, whose heart hath moved him to do this? And Esther said, The man, the oppressor, and the enemy, is this evil Haman. Then Haman was troubled before the king and queen. And the king in his wrath rose from the feast of wine, and passed into the garden of the palace, and Haman stood up to plead with Queen Esther for her life, because he saw that evil was already determined for him by the king. So when the king returned from the palace garden to the house of the wine banquet, Haman fell prostrate on the bed on which Esther lay. Then said the king, Would he also want to force the queen before me in this house? When this word came out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then said Harbona, one of the chamberlains that served before the king, Behold, also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke in the king's defense, is by Haman's house. Then the king said, hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows, which he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's anger subsided. Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and leave a comment. Esther 8. That same day King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came before the king, because Esther had declared who he was. And she took off the king's ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther put Mordecai in charge of Haman's house. Esther spoke more before the king, and threw herself at his feet, and she wept, and besought him to revoke the wickedness of Haman the Agagite, and the purpose which he had designed against the Jews. And the king held out the golden scepter to Esther. Then Esther arose and stood before the king. And he said, "If it seems good to the king, and if I have found favor with him, and if this matter is right in the king's sight, and if I please him in his eyes, let it be written that the letters conceived by Haman son of Hammedatha be revoked. The Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews, who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I see the evil that will come to my people? And how can I see the destruction of my family?" Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, "Behold, I gave Esther the house of Haman, and they hanged him on a gallows, because he had stretched out his hands against the Jews. Write therefore to the Jews, as seems good in your eyes, in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring, because the document that is written in the name of the king, and that is sealed with the king's ring, cannot be revoked." Then the king's clerks were called at that same time, in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, and also to the satraps, and to the governors, and to the leaders of the provinces, which extended from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to each province according to its manner of right, and to every people according to their language, and also to the Jews according to their manner of writing, and according to their language. And it was written in the name of King Ahasuerus, and, sealing them with the king's ring, they sent the letters by the hand of couriers on horseback, who rode on horses, which were from the king's stables. In them, the king granted the Jews, who were in each city, to gather together and prepare themselves to defend their lives, and to destroy, kill and annihilate all the forces of the people in the province that came against them, children and women, and their possessions were plundered. On the same day, in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. And a copy of the letter would be circulated as a decree in all the provinces, and published among all the people, so that the Jews would be prepared for that day, to take revenge on their enemies. The couriers, on swift riders, left hurriedly, impelled by the king's word, and this order was published in the fortress of Susa. Then Mordecai came out from the king's presence in royal robes of sky blue and white, with a great crown of gold, and with a robe of fine purple linen, and the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. And to the Jews there was light, and gladness, and joy, and honor. Also in every province, and in every city, wherever the king's word and his command reached, there was joy and joy among the Jews, banquets and days of merrymaking, and many of the people of the land became Jews, because the fear of the Jews had fallen upon them. Esther 9. And in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same month in which the word of the king came and his command to be carried out, in the day on which the enemies of the Jews expected to master them, there came to pass the contrary, because the Jews were the ones who took control of those who hated them. For the Jews in their cities, in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, gathered together to lay their hands on those who sought harm from him, and no one could resist them, because their fear had fallen on all those people. And all the leaders of the provinces, and the satraps, and the governors, and those who did the king's work, helped the Jews, for the fear of Mordecai had fallen upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame grew throughout all the provinces, because the man Mordecai was becoming great. So the Jews struck down all their enemies with swords, with slaughter and with destruction, and they did to their enemies what they wanted. And in the fortress of Susa the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, as well as Parsanata, and Dalphum and Aspida, and Porata, and Adalia, and Aridata, and Pharmasta, and Arisai, and Aridai, and Visata, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, killed, but they did not extend their hand to the spoil. On the same day, the number of those killed in the Susa fortress was communicated to the king. And the king said unto Esther the queen, In the fortress of Susa the Jews slew and destroyed 500 men, and the 10 sons of Haman, in the king's most provinces what would they have done? So what is your request? And it will be given to you. Or what is your requirement? And it will be done. Then Esther said, If it seems good to the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan that they also do tomorrow according to today's commandment, and hang the 10 sons of Haman on a gallows. Then the king said to do so, and an edict was published in Susa, and they hanged the 10 sons of Haman. And the Jews who were in Susa also gathered together on the 14th day of the month Adar, and killed 300 men in Susa, but they did not extend their hand to the spoil. Also the other Jews who were in the king's provinces gathered together and prepared themselves in defense of their lives, and had rest from their enemies, and they killed 75,000 of their enemies, but they did not extend their hand to the spoil. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and they rested on the 14th day, and made that day a day of feasting and joy. Also the Jews, who were in Susa, gathered together on the 13th and 14th of the same, and they rested on the 15th, and made that day a day of feasting and joy. But the Jews of the villages, who dwelt in the towns, made the 14th day of the month of Adar a day of gladness and feasting, and a day of merrymaking, and of sending gifts to one another. And Mordecai wrote these things, and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, to those near and to those far away, commanding them to observe the 14th day of the month Adar, and the 15th day thereof, every year, like the days in which the Jews had rest from their enemies, in the month that turned them from sorrow into joy, and from mourning into a feast day, so that they made them a day of feasting and gladness, and of sending gifts to one another, others, and gifts to the poor. And the Jews undertook to do what they had already begun, as well as what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had intended to destroy the Jews, and had cast that is, the lot, to desolate and destroy them. But when this came before the king, he ordered by letters that the evil intention that Haman had formed against the Jews should be brought back upon his head, so they hung him and his sons on a gallows. That's why they call those days Purim, from the name Pur, so also because of all the words of that letter, and what they saw about it, and what had happened to them. The Jews confirmed, and took it upon themselves, and upon their descendants, and upon all that came near to them, that these 2 days should not fail to be kept according to what was written about them, and according to their appointed time, all the years. And that these days would be remembered and kept in every generation, family, province and city, and that these days of Purim would not be revoked among the Jews, and that the memory of them would never end among those of their descendants. Then Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew, wrote with all authority a second time, to confirm the letter concerning Purim. And they sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim in their appointed times, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had established for them, and as they themselves had already established for themselves and for their descendants, regarding fasting and their cry. And Esther's command established the successes of that Purim, and it was written in the book. Esther 10. After this King Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the land and on the islands of the sea. And all the deeds of his power and valor, and the record of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king exalted, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For the Jew Mordecai was the second after King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and esteemed by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people, and proclaiming the prosperity of all his offspring. Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and leave a comment.